The character crisis. A problem that plagues many fighting gamers each and every day. A problem that, although being an extremely common roadblock for players of any skill level, often goes untalked about. Today, we are going to change that. In this video, I'm going to break down what exactly a character crisis is, provide my own philosophy on the subject, and most important of all, tell you how to fix it. First, let's define what exactly a character crisis is. Simply speaking, a character crisis is when you cannot decide who to sink time into between multiple playable characters. This problem exists in a number of different game genres, but in fighting games, it's probably at its worst. This is because, in order to pick up and learn a fighting game character, you need to sink hours upon hours practicing combos and getting used to their tools in order to play at a surface level, unlike, say, switching from Doc to Kapkan in Rainbow Six Siege. The time cost that comes with learning a character is what makes a character crisis dangerous to your average fighting game player, and is the number one reason most players won't pick up more than one or two characters. However, in a game like Street Fighter V, there are over 40 characters, and so it's often hard to choose just one or two to spend time with, and this is what we call a character crisis. As promised, I'm going to be providing my own philosophy on the topic of character crises, and I see each character crisis to fall into one of a few different stages. These stages occur in different spots in a player's experience with a game, and these stages are as follows: a beginner stage crisis, early stage crisis, intermediate stage crisis, DLC character crisis, and late stage crisis. Let's begin with the beginner stage crisis. The beginner stage character crisis occurs very early on into a player's lifespan in a game, and usually pertains to the individual's choice of their first main. Oftentimes, a big portion of this crisis is the overwhelming feeling of booting up character select and seeing millions of different faces, but nobody who really stands out. This crisis pertains a lot more to the aesthetical side of choosing a main than other stages of the character crisis. Having character design, visuals, alternate colors, and personality contribute a lot to making that initial choice. That being said, gameplay also has just as much of an effect on the initial choice as aesthetics do. When you're new to a fighting game, you don't understand all of the system mechanics or gameplay elements very well, so it is very difficult to visualize the full potential of any character just by booting them up in training mode, much less the potential of 50 characters. Nobody wants to spend 10 or more hours sifting through every single character thoroughly before even getting to play the game. But, at the same time, nobody wants to feel like if they only dug through character select a little longer, they may have found that special character they didn't have before. To summarize, the beginner stage character crisis occurs at the very beginning of a player's experience with any given game, and pertains to the stress of choosing the first character they want to play without fully understanding most or any of the system mechanics and roster dynamics. An example of the beginner stage character crisis can be seen in my brief experience with BlazBlue Central Fiction. When I booted up the game, it turned out all the characters I thought looked visually cool didn't really speak to me gameplay-wise. I kept trying new characters, but nobody in the cast really made me excited to play the game. I was about to give up the game for good when I tried out S, and she fit the bill for me gameplay-wise. The problem? I really don't like her visual design. I think she looks pretty boring, and I've always hated that whole lolly with a massive sword shtick. Not sure why, I just don't like it. Even though I really enjoyed S gameplay-wise, I couldn't see her representing me as a player. After all, in the FGC, your main ends up becoming your identity, and I did not want my identity to become S. So how does one come to cure this character crisis? Of course, the most simple way would be to just try everyone out and see who feels best, but oftentimes that isn't the most efficient choice. I'd recommend looking up character guides and wikis to give you a good understanding of how the character will operate at a higher level of play, and then use that information to narrow your choice down to around 5 or less characters. Then, go ahead and learn the basic options for each character. Learn a few B&Bs, some setups, and make sure you know all of their command inputs. After that, decide who you like the best. Remember that aesthetics is a completely viable reason for not wanting to main a character. If you think the character doesn't suit you aesthetically, but you decide to push through that frustration against your better judgment, 9 times out of 10, that's going to leave you an unhappy player. Good resources for getting over this character crisis would be the Dustloop wiki, Novorelki's Guilty Gear Accent Core Plus R character guides, my own Guilty Gear Strive character guides, and the numerous fighting game discords. Okay, so you're just getting into the meat of the game. You understand the system mechanics a little more, and you can see your character's options a little bit clearer, but maybe you've realized that you didn't exactly get what you signed up for. The early stage character crisis pertains to the period of one's experience where they are just on the cusp of understanding the game, and in the instance of the crisis, This newfound understanding comes with some regret regarding the character they picked. Maybe you discovered that a character you initially paid no attention to has some interesting tools that you couldn't see in your first few hours of playing the game. I have an example of an early stage character crisis that occurred during my experience with Granblue Fantasy Versus. When I first got the game, the characters that looked the most appealing to me were characters like Percival and Lancelot, and the ones I didn't like were characters like Gran and Catalina. However, once I started to play the game a little more, I realized that my initial outlook on the roster was completely wrong. I tend to enjoy characters who have a strong neutral presence and reliable pressure tools. Initially, when I looked at Catalina, I saw a character who had a useless unique ability, a crappy Tatsu that was punishable on block, and a subpar pressure game. Boy, was I wrong. As I played more and watched others play, I began to realize that Catalina was almost exactly the character I had been looking for. I just simply didn't realize it at first. Yet, that raised the question. Do I keep working on my Lancelot, or throw away all my knowledge in favor of Catalina? Eventually, I decided to make the switch, and I ended up being very happy with Catalina in the long run. At this point in the Crysis' development, character loyalty becomes a factor. It's often stressful for players to switch from the character they already became familiar with to someone who is completely unfamiliar, and that ends up becoming a major factor in why people stick with their initial main even if they aren't making that person happy. Since this crisis occurs during the early stages of one's experience, I'd recommend completely ignoring character loyalty as a factor. Instead, go ahead and learn that character you're interested in. Figure out what they do, and play some matches with people around or slightly below your skill level, so that you can both understand what the character excels at and what they struggle with. After that, see if you still feel like this character is a better fit for you. If they are, then make the switch. If they aren't, then don't. The wikis and guides are always reliable resources, but I'd recommend watching some high-level play with both your main and the character you're interested in maining in order to gain a better understanding of the choices you're going to make. The intermediate stage crisis happens around the time when you've likely finally gotten completely familiar with your character's entire toolkit and have a good understanding of what to look out for when fighting any other character as well. This stage of the crisis is very similar to the early stage character crisis in terms of the actual condition of the crisis, both generally having something to do with finding out your main wasn't exactly what you hoped for when played optimally, and that another character in the roster is. What makes this stage more difficult is character loyalty. If you've made it to the intermediate level in any game, you've likely sunk hundreds of hours into your main character, and after spending so much time with a character, you gain an attachment to them. This attachment can make it hard to move on to a character who you think might be better suited for you, as people will already know you as an X-character main, and you will know yourself as one as well. Of course, this problem can also be reversed too. Sometimes, after spending hundreds of hours with just one character, you'll start to get bored with said character. You'll end up being frustrated by their weaknesses and become spiteful and upset with your own main, which oftentimes will lead to the feeling of not wanting to play the game at all. This can become a huge roadblock in your growth as a fighting game player, as your brain will gradually push the blame of certain scenarios onto your character, rather than thinking critically about each loss and improving because of it. These two different problems both have two different solutions, and for the first one, the solution is more or less the same as the early stage crisis. Go ahead and spend a little time with the character you're interested in, and don't worry about what people might think of you. Even the people with the most eyes on them will switch characters when they feel like they want to. However, this stage is more subjective than all the others, so the best advice I can offer is that if it feels like it would be worth it in the long run to switch to a character you might be happy with, then do it. For the problem of becoming spiteful with your main, I'd ask that you take a step back and look at things from a fresh point of view. When you go on long losing streaks or get destroyed a couple of times in a row, it's easy to try to push the blame onto the only other contributing factor of your loss, your character. However, even if your character is the absolute worst piece of garbage character in the world, there is no possible way you played them perfectly in those matches you were losing. The great thing about fighting games is the room for growth, and if you intentionally deny yourself this room for potential and cry that you're losing because of your character's weaknesses, instead of learning how to play around those weaknesses, you're only hurting yourself. That being said, if the weaknesses of your character turn out to be too much for you to handle, and don't feel bad if they are, then go ahead and make the switch. If you can't find happiness in playing your main, even after taking a step back and evaluating the situation, then you won't enjoy playing the game ever. This character crisis is the most unique of all because it pertains to an option you weren't even presented with when first introduced to the game. A DLC character crisis occurs when, after choosing a main, a DLC character drops that you find to possibly be more fitting for you than the main you ended up choosing in the first place. This can be especially tricky to deal with because it would have been impossible to see the DLC character coming, so you've already devoted your full effort into learning a character that seems lackluster to the new one that was just released. This can leave players feeling like they've been sidelined by the release of a new DLC, leaving them feeling unconfident in the choice they have to make. Price can also be an inhibiting factor. If you think a character looks super cool, but to play them, you need to buy a $30 expansion pack before you even get to try them out, you can often end up feeling worried and concerned about wasting your money. Sadly, I don't think I'm qualified to offer you financial advice, so whether a character purchase is worth it to you is for you to decide. But I'd say if a DLC character speaks to you more than your main, then start playing them in the background of playing your main. Watch closely as the meta for the character develops, as it could end up that the character doesn't play anything like what you were excited for in the first place. Personally, I would stick with my current main so long as they still feel just as fine to play without factoring in said DLC character. Like I said, oftentimes your impressions of a character can end up being different than the actual character themselves. So if you're perfectly happy playing your main and you only want to switch because you think it might make you happier, I'd say play your main and maybe pick up the DLC character as a secondary. If you are unhappy with your main, or you think the DLC character fits you a substantially higher amount than your main, then go ahead and switch to playing the DLC character. The late stage character crisis comes near the end of one's fighting game journey. After spending hundreds, if not thousands of hours perfecting and honing your skills, entering in tournaments, and practicing to truly become the best. After making it to the highest level of competitive integrity, character viability becomes a real issue. Sometimes you will make it to the top with a character you love, but realize you can't compete with any of the other players up there because your main lacks the tools to do so, and when both players are playing as close to optimally as humanly possible, this can become a real issue at top level play. Another possible instance of this scenario could be after a surprise nerf to your main. Oftentimes, switching from a non-viable character after you've spent so much time with them can feel next to impossible, since people already know your name, and know your main once you've made it to the top level of play. But even still, you know you aren't going to win EVO with early Street Fighter V post-nerf Nash. A high-level Street Fighter V player by the name of Brian F. discussed this topic in a video regarding a little Twitter drama concerning the subject. Brian himself had had an experience referring to this stage of the character crisis around Street Fighter League Season 1. Brian was a player for Team Spirit in Street Fighter League Season 1, and in that tournament series, you were allowed to ban one character from the opponent's team, and nobody on said team can play that character. Everyone on Spirit but Brian F. had a bit of character flexibility, but Brian played Balrog almost exclusively. Because of this, opposing teams knew they could just ban Balrog and get free wins against Brian, since they knew his Abigail wasn't going to be nearly as much of a threat. So, this already put a bit of a sour taste into Brian's mouth with Balrog. However, at the very same time of this event, Balrog got nerfed, sending him into a realm of unviability, which Brian certainly struggled with. He had all this pressure to keep playing this unviable character since everybody already knew who he was, but even with all that, he decided to pick up G. To this day, he still uses G to cover Rog's uncomfortable matchups, and ever since picking up G, he has become a much better player than if he had just kept playing Balrog, and overall is very happy with his time investment into this character. Another example of this happening was with the beast Daigo himself. Throughout his Street Fighter career, Daigo was always known for playing Ryu. So much so, that commentators have even mistaken his name to be Ryu. So it's pretty clear to say that Daigo was synonymous with Ryu at this point. However, when Street Fighter V came around and Ryu was bottom tier, what did Daigo do? Well, he didn't pay any attention to this pressure to be Ryu and picked up Guile. Why? Because he felt he could do better with Guile. And that is what the solution is for dealing with a late-stage character crisis. If you honestly think you can do better in bracket with a top tier, don't let any of the other scrubs put you down by calling you a tier whore or a character traitor. If you're playing at the top level of play, you're playing to win, so don't restrict yourself because of what other people think. If you do want to play your low tier, then more power to you. I'm not saying everyone at a top level has to pick a top 5 character. I'm simply saying that if you feel like you want to switch to a better character, but you're afraid people will call you out for it, just do it. The character crisis continues to plague the fighting game community, but I hope by bringing attention to the issue, I can help in resolving it. If you enjoyed this video, help me out by bringing the subscriber graph to at least a reasonable level, and leave a comment down below telling me about any experiences you've had with this issue. For now though, that's all. I hope to see you in the next one. Peace.